Lowenstein from the University of Vermont. He has worked in conservation for over 25 years, 19 of them in the Berkshires for the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a leading conservation organization working around the world to protect ecologically important lands and waters. Frank started out working on Berkshire preservations and has since expanded his purview to the international scene. His title now, it's a long one, but I will read it to you, is the Climate Adaptation Leader for the Nature Conservancy Global Climate Change Team. Please join me in welcoming Frank Lowenstein this afternoon.
Thank you, Lori, and thanks also to Kristen and the Spectrum Playhouse and to the co-sponsoring organizations. I'll plan to go through them all, but I won't do that. Since we're all a little chilly, I'm going to try and abbreviate the talk a little bit, and hopefully you all will still be warm enough to stay for questions. I'm going to start by showing you a quote. This was how one leading magazine or newspaper started its coverage of the Durban climate talks. It said that 100 years from now, looking back, the only question that will appear important about the historical moment in which we now live is the question of whether or not we did anything to arrest climate change. Now, of course, this is very gratifying to me. We all like to think that we work on important issues, right? But my message today is that we all must work on this important issue together, and that really it isn't my job to do something about the problem. It's all of our jobs to do something about the problem, and without that, we can't do anything about the problem. But just to sort of give you a sense of where the international discussion is going, I have a little quiz about this quote, and that is, which of these three publications, Mother Jones, The Economist, or the New York Times, started their coverage this way? So who thinks that it was Mother Jones? Nobody. Two people think it was Mother Jones. Who thinks it was The Economist? About half the audience. And who thinks it was the New York Times? A little bit less than half the audience. Well, you guys are too smart. It was, in fact, The Economist that started this coverage this way. So, before I tell you about the Durban climate negotiations and then talk a little bit about what it means here in the Berkshires, what climate change means here in the Berkshires, and then finish up with what we can and should do about it, I wanted to frame up why the climate negotiations are difficult. And so this bubble chart, which comes from The Guardian, shows the carbon emissions of every country of the world. And the big red circle on the left is the United States. The even bigger blue circle on the right is China. These grouping of purple circles in the middle is Europe. And what this chart shows is no one country can fix the climate problem. The US and China together, the two biggest, are only 45% of present-day emissions. So really, all the countries of the world need to come together to reduce emissions if we're actually going to respond to the carbon pollution of the atmosphere. Now that has been the position of many countries in the negotiations, but there have been other countries that have a different perspective, and their perspective is this, which is, well, gee, United States, if you look at cumulative emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution, the United States is by far the biggest contributor to the carbon that is in the atmosphere now, because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, depending how much is already up there, for anywhere from 100 to 100,000 years. The US, Russia, Germany, the United Kingdom are by far the biggest historical emitters among the four of us. And so countries like India, they say, you guys have benefited from cheap energy. Your economic growth was fueled by fossil fuels. You know, why should we have to reduce our emissions? We're just starting our growth. In India and China, even though both countries now have a growing middle class and even growing upper class, the average per capita income is about 5% of that of the average per capita income across Europe, Japan, and North America. So their perspective is, well, you know, what the heck? We still want to grow. We still want the same thing you guys had. Well, the huge breakthrough in Durban, so the vehicle where all this gets discussed is under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came out of the Rio conference 20 years ago in 1992. There's Rio Plus 20 happening this June. There's a lot of attention focused on that internationally, what's going to happen. But the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came out of that. There's 195 countries that are party to it. And the way it works is that decisions have to be made by consensus. Any one country can block an international agreement. So, under this convention. So, of course, those two different perspectives have been somewhat at war over the years. And what was really significant that happened this time is that there was a break apart of the coalition of countries that have been saying, you know, no, it's your problem, United States and Europe. And so countries like Grenada, like Tuvalu and Kiribati, which are literally starting to plan for how they are going to evacuate their populations and bring their country to an end. They said, wait a minute, China and India and Brazil, you guys are talking about economic growth, we're talking about survival. And one of the things that I think needs to happen moving forward is we all need to start thinking about not just short-term interests and short-term economic interests, but our long-term interests and our long-term economic interests. So in Durban, there was a clear agreement that all countries will reduce their emissions. And so that was a huge breakthrough because as that first bubble chart showed, no matter what you think about the merits or lack thereof of the past emissions argument, we can't fix the problem today unless all countries do take that step. So that was huge. Less huge was they agreed that we're going to decide how much to reduce 4 years from now. And we're going to start reducing in 2020, 9 years from now. And as I'll show you a bit later, those 9 years are crucially important. And if we wait that long to start reducing our emissions, then we are going to be in real trouble. So, why should we care about climate change here in the Berkshires? I'm going to show you a little bit about what's going on with the global climate system, what some of the latest scientific understanding of that is, and what it means for here in the Berkshires before I turn to what we can do about it. This is past temperature here in the Berkshires. I'm sure those of you in the back can't see that this is a record from 1950 to the late 2000s. And over that time, there's a very gradual but statistically significant trend of increasing temperatures. Quite gradual. Doesn't look necessarily like that much to worry about. Unfortunately, if you look at this on a global basis and you look at it over time, what you find is that the trend line, if you look, the more recently you look at the trends, the steeper they are. And so what we're now looking at in recent years is a 3 degree Celsius, which is about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, increase per century. Whereas in the past 100 years, we've had an increase of about 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a little bit more, but it still doesn't necessarily sound unmanageable. Just what does that look like geographically? This is a tool that the Nature Conservancy put together called Climate Wizard. It's at climatewizard.org. You can go on, you can look at future temperature, future precipitation under different emission scenarios, different climate models for any place in the world that you care about. So I looked at New England. This is an end of the century plot. And I want you to notice two things. First of all, we're looking in interior New England, our part of New England, by the end of the century using the mid-range of the climate models that have been certified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We're looking at about a 7.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature. That is almost certainly wrong. And it's unfortunately almost certainly wrong in being an underestimate of the pace of climate change and the extent of climate change. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the latest research on sensitivity is seeming to indicate that the climate system is much more sensitive. It responds more to carbon dioxide emissions than we thought. And the other reason is that emissions, as I'll show in a moment, are exceeding even this high emissions scenario that I ran this with. So more likely, we're going to see this level of change by the middle of this century, by 2050 or 2060. So most of us here in the room will get to experience some of that, and all of our children and grandchildren will. Why do we care about this? Well, the real reason is not because of the average temperature increases that I just showed. It's because of the extremes. And this is a chart that shows if you take a bell curve and you move it a little bit, you move the median, the median a little bit, you move the extremes much more. You get much more area under the curve, you get much more occurrence of extreme weather. And you start to see some new extremes that you've never seen before. And so are we seeing that? Well, yes, we are. This is a plot of the hottest days in North America, and the warmest 10% of days in this blue line are now about 50% more common than they used to be in 1950. So we're starting to see more of these extremes. With a 7 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature, which I believe we will probably see by mid-century, by end of century certainly, we're talking about land temperatures increasing by 10 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're talking, what that means in terms of the hottest days of the year is in China they'll be somewhat hotter, 11 to 14 degrees hotter. In Germany, come on, where's Germany? In Germany, they'll be 14 to 18 degrees hotter. And here in New York City, and remember, interior New England gets hotter than the coast, 18 to 21 degrees hotter. These are the hottest days of the year. So last year in New York, summer temperatures reached a new record of 104 degrees. So what we're talking about is that by the middle to end of this century, we might be seeing heat waves in New York City of more than 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This is going to be a real challenge. We're going to see mortalities. Just as France saw 20,000 dead in their heat wave of 2003, and Russia saw 56,000 dead in their heat wave of 2010. We have just been lucky so far. So, it's an old saying, it's not the heat, it's the humidity. Unfortunately, that's also probably true. This is a chart of how much rain is now falling in the heaviest 1% of precipitation events. So in the very heavy rainstorms, how much more rain is now falling in those rainstorms today as compared to about 50 years ago, the early 1950s. And you can see here in the Northeast, we got a lot more water. Well, that is in large part because of where all the heat that is trapped by the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes. Most of it is being absorbed by the oceans. And that has two very important effects. One is that it drives more moisture into the atmosphere. So there's about 7% more moisture in the atmosphere today than there was in the 1950s. That translates to about a 4% increase in precipitation over land on average, because some of that moisture falls back onto the oceans. Not all of it ends up on the land. And it also translates into more powerful hurricanes. Not more frequent hurricanes, but the ones we get are probably more powerful, and more powerful storms. Kevin Trenberth, one of our leading climatologists with the National Center for Atmospheric Research, has just published a paper in which he argues that we should now assume that every storm has a human footprint in it and is stronger than it would have been without climate change. So what does that translate into? Well, that translates into floods, because that 4% average increase in precipitation, again, produces that significant increase in extremes, and some extremes that we've never seen before. So Pakistan in 2010, Australia in 2010. I really want to know what happened to this wombat, and I don't know how to find out. But 80% of the province of Queensland at one point was underwater. Queensland is a good, maybe a sixth to an eighth of Australia. Colombia, 2010 to 2011, the Magdalena River, which is the Magdalena Basin is the source of 80% of Colombia's economic activity, was devastated. They lost between 2 and 3% of their GDP in that event. Brazil, massive flooding early last year with mudslides and 3,000 dead. Tennessee, May of 2010. This isn't just a problem overseas. In Tennessee, they had 14 to 18 inches of rain in 2 days on May 1st and 2nd of 2010. Prior to that, the heaviest 2-day rainfall in Tennessee had been 7 inches. So we're going to see more of these sudden and dramatic increases in record precipitation and temperature. Here in the United States this year, 2012, in the first week of this year, we set more than 1,000 high temperature records. I'm sort of wishing for one of them right now. We broke some of those old records, many of those old records across the Midwest by 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So it wasn't just that the old record had been 43 and now we got a 45 degree day. We just blew them away. Same thing with this Tennessee rainstorm. May of last year, the floods in the Mississippi Basin, the second 500-year flood in the last 25 years. They also, during that same time period, had, I believe, 2 100-year floods. In theory, the way the National Emergency Management Administration, Federal Emergency Management Administration calculates these floods, there should be a 1 in 500 chance of having a 500-year flood in any given year, and a 1 in 100 chance of a 100-year flood. So the odds of getting 2 of each in 25 years, very, very small. Now, is that all due to climate change? No, it is not. There are 3 factors. One is climate change, and I've already talked about that. The second is natural variability. Today is cold, yesterday wasn't as bad. There's huge variability in the weather, and that is a significant part of some of these extreme events. And then the third factor is land use. The more land we pave, the faster the rain runs off of it. The Mississippi Basin has seen huge development over the last 30, 40 years. FEMA hasn't necessarily kept up in terms of tracking that. So, sorting out those various factors is perhaps of importance, but we know that climate change is one of the important factors, and as I'll get to, we can do something about it without huge changes in our lifestyle. Finally, the last flood photo I'm going to show you. This was Route 4 leading to Killington in Vermont before Hurricanes Irene and Tropical Storm Lee hit us. Huge damage across Vermont, as well as the Catskills in New York. You can think about those two framing us here in the Berkshires, just to the north, just to the west. We just got lucky. So this is a map from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of extreme weather in 2011 in terms of precipitation. And everything that is shown in red or orange is about 10 to 20 inches less precipitation than normal. And everything that's shown in purple and blue is 10 to 20 inches more of precipitation than normal. Our average precipitation here in the Berkshires is around 40 inches per year, so we're talking a year where we got about 50% more rain across the Northeast than we typically would. And this is another predicted effect of climate change, that the places that have more water, the forecasts are that those will tend in general to get wetter, and the places that have less water, it will in general tend to get drier. So if any of you were thinking of moving to Arizona or New Mexico or Texas, I recommend reconsidering. Again, just to show the same chart one more time, it's these extremes, this change in the extremes with a relatively minor change in the average that's really going to drive the impacts on us. So what are those impacts? This is a graph from Sandia National Laboratories, not exactly a hotbed of environmental extremism. And what you want to look at is this 50% line, which is, there's about a 50-50 chance of this much economic damage occurring in the United States. And what it corresponds to is about $1.1 trillion of our GDP. That's an equivalent impact to the current economic downturn, which is pretty severe. And what's interesting about the report is they said two things that I think are worth noting in the text. One is they said, if we had looked farther out than 2050, we would have seen much more severe damage. And the other thing they said is, in the extreme cases, if the extreme forecasts of climate change are correct, we're talking about the loss of the majority of the US economy. So that's a scary outcome. And that's something that we ought to be thinking about as a risk, and something we ought to be doing something to address our uncertainty. Most of us buy insurance to address much, much smaller risks than that. So the top line is exceedance probability, the probability of seeing damage this great or greater. So this middle line is a 50% exceedance probability. This is GDP loss in billions in 2008 dollars. And it starts at 500 billion and it goes to 2.5 trillion.
And the three curves?
The red line is the central trend, and the dashed lines are their estimates of uncertainty around that trend. I believe 95% confidence limits, but I'd have to actually go back and look at the report to be sure. We will have plenty of time for discussion afterwards for anyone who's not too frozen. Okay, so not accounted for in everything I have shown you so far is a concept that the senior scientists on my team and I are about to publish about, which is the concept of cascading climate impacts. And to explain this, I want to sort of show you a picture that should look very familiar. This is the Halloween snowstorm here in the Berkshires. And what did that produce? Well, it produced 3 million people without power, but it was a snowstorm. What's that got to do with climate change, with global warming? Well, we had had a enormously warm fall. I don't know about the rest of you, but I was picking okra, tomatoes, and peppers from my garden on October 27th. On October 28th, they were all dead, but anyway. That resulted in the trees still having their leaves. Then we've got that effect we talked about before of there already being more moisture in the air, more moisture in every storm. This was the heaviest October snowfall in New England since the snow hurricane of 1804. And in many, many parts of New England, including here in the Berkshires, it greatly exceeded the impacts of the snow hurricane in terms of total depth of snow. Now, the fact that it was cold, that was that natural variability that I was talking about. It hit a random cold, all that water came off the ocean in the form of a nor'easter, not a hurricane, and hit a cold front and fell as snow instead of just a very, very heavy rainstorm. And it fell on those leaves that were still on the trees because of the warm fall, and the result is that. Here's a very different type of cascading impact. I'm sure this is going to be difficult for those of you in the back to see. I'm going to try not to scare any of you by tripping off the stages. This is from the Grenadines in the Eastern Caribbean. And this is the island of Petite St. Vincent's, and this is Petite Martinique. Can you guys see the waves breaking here? Those waves are breaking on a coral reef, on a living coral reef, which is protecting this island. The reason there are no waves breaking here is that coral reef died in the early 2000s due to an extreme warm temperature event, which causes coral bleaching, where the corals expel their symbiotic algae, and then often they then die. Sometimes they're able to recover. So they don't have that coral reef anymore. And that's already having effects. You can see how Petite St. Vincent is outlined in white. That's beaches. They're missing from Petite Martinique. And they didn't used to be missing. So the next time one of these comes along, Petite Martinique is going to be in trouble. And you're going to see reports of tremendous damage on Petite Martinique if we ever hear about Petite Martinique. I'm not sure we actually will. But for example, El Salvador had, I believe it was over 50 inches of rain in this fall, made no news in the US whatsoever. But that kind of cascading impact is going to happen in many, many areas. I have lots more examples that I'm not going to share with you today. But they're very hard to predict. They're the interactions of these random events with climate change, with effects that we don't fully understand, and we don't see them. We can't predict when they're going to occur. We can't necessarily predict how severe they're going to be. So they're not accounted for in those estimates of economic damage. Okay, so what are we looking at here in the Berkshires? What can we say? Well, we know we're looking at heat. We already talked about that. We know we're looking at significantly more storms and more significant storms, and consequently, more floods. Those are all of concern. But I think of more concern are some of the secondary impacts. So, one really important one is we're going to start to see the ranges of trees shifting north. And in fact, botanists have already tracked this quite a bit. You can document, particularly with some of the smaller plants, their migration north. What that is going to mean for our trees is some of the trees that are characteristic of this area are going to start to die out and not to regenerate. And it's going to happen first with the lack of regeneration. The seedlings tend to be more sensitive. And later with the deaths of the trees. So sugar maples, for example, are forecast to move out of Massachusetts, in fact, out of the United States altogether. Their range is predicted to shift to Canada. So investing in 50-year futures in Canadian maple syrup might be a reasonable choice right now. That impact is not going to happen sort of in necessarily a very even, progressive way. It's probably going to be sporadic, triggered by extreme heat waves or by extreme snowstorms falling when they already have their leaves, or by insects that we don't presently have moving into the area. This photo happens to be the Asian longhorn beetle, which is a non-native insect that is spreading around Worcester, Massachusetts, despite the efforts of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the State Department of Agriculture to fight them. We're going to see those, both more non-native insects moving in, but also native insects from further south moving up here, starting to affect our trees, and even our local traditional insects that the trees have co-evolved with, sometimes being able to fit in an extra generation in a summer and having greater impacts than they used to have. So this is part of the reason why work of organizations like Project Native is so important. So that we do focus on the plants that are native to this area, so we're not bringing plants in from outside that maybe are also bringing their insects with them. So, secondly, poison ivy. Just as a, who cares about poison ivy? Well, we should all care a little bit about poison ivy, because it responds not just to increased temperature by growing more, it also responds directly to carbon dioxide more vigorously than almost any other plant that has been tested so far. And it responds both with increased growth and with increased toxicity. So I personally, as someone who's very sensitive to not to carbon dioxide to my knowledge, but to poison ivy, I am really not looking forward to that. And finally, we're going to see disruptions to the economy. If we lose the sugar maples, that's what paints our hills orange in the fall. That's what attracts the leaf peepers. If we lose the snow, that isn't a good thing for jiminy or butternut or catamount or any of our other winter sports that draw people to the area. If we start to see more floods, if we start to see more insects affecting our agricultural crops, those are all significant disruptions to our economy. And we need to think about how we keep the economy resilient, how we keep our farms resilient, like Berkshire Grown is working on. So, what can we do about it? Well, the short answer is we aren't doing anything yet. These are global carbon dioxide emission trends starting in 1750 to 2000. And over the last 100 years, since the early 1900s, we've seen an increase of about 2.7% per year in global emissions of carbon dioxide. Over the first part of the last decade, that rate went up, and we saw 3.5% increases per year. And if you look at just the last couple of years, we're seeing a 5.6% per year increase in emissions of carbon dioxide. So if we want to forestall some of these impacts, and we don't want them to get worse, keep in mind, most of what I've shown you are impacts that we are already experiencing and seeing. If we don't want them to get worse, we need to do something about this. So, what can we do about it? This is one of my favorite graphs, and it's almost the last graph I'm going to show you. This is from California, and California has passed a law that requires it to reduce its emissions by 80%. It requires it to reduce its emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And then it requires it by 2050 to reduce its emissions to 80% below its 1990 levels. That's a pretty ambitious goal, and if it does it quickly enough, that would be what we need to do. This study, which was just published in Science, was commissioned by, and I mean just published last week, was commissioned by the state of California to say, how do we do that? How do we get to 80% below current emissions? So this big blue chunk that pretty much keeps its power needs level over the next 40 years, that is all increases in efficiency. That is all conservation and improvements in the efficiency of lighting, of heating, of transportation. And it's a 1.3% per year increase in energy efficiency. Now, I bet most of us, if we thought about it, could identify things that we could do to shave our energy 1.3%, our energy use 1.3% by next year without much disruption in our lifestyles. And we just need to do that again and again for 40 years. But the good news is we get improved technology as time goes along that helps us do that. This second big chunk, this gray, is decarbonization of the electricity generation sector. So in other words, they assumed that by 2050, 90% of the carbon emissions from energy generation were gone. And they said there are 3 ways to do that. One is by renewables, wind and solar. One is by nuclear, and one is by carbon capture and storage, and which is capturing carbon emitted from fossil fuel power plants. And the technology for doing that is no different, in essence, than the technology that's already in use for scrubbing sulfur out of power plant emissions. It's just a slightly different chemistry, same exact devices. So this isn't rocket science. This is stuff, all 3 of those are things we know how to do today. They said all 3 of them would work, and the cost to do it any of those 3 ways was roughly equivalent. And then down here, this green is getting rid of carbon emissions reducing carbon emissions from agriculture and cement production. And this yellow is shifting California's car fleet to largely electric vehicles over 50 years. And you can see that they don't really kick that in. You probably can't see, actually. They don't really expect a big increase in that until 2020 to 2030. So they're giving us some time for the electric vehicle technology to improve. Key things about this study. The first is they did not assume any lifestyle changes by Californians. They still have Californians driving just as many miles, having their own cars, living where they live to a large extent. They do predict for future growth, which is this pale green line. It's based on smart growth, having people live closer to where they work, closer to shopping, that sort of thing. So there is some reduction due to that. But no major lifestyle changes. They didn't say you gotta ride your bicycle, you're gonna have to take public transportation everywhere, you gotta become a vegetarian. No, none of that. The second thing is, the cost of this was 1.3% of the gross state product. Now contrast that to the risk that the Sandia Lab said that the US is under from climate change, which is we're looking at a potential approximately 5 to 10% risk to our gross domestic product from climate change if we don't do anything. Oh, what if we wait? So this study assumes that Californians start acting right away in 2010. If you wait till 2020, you need a much steeper reduction to get back to the curve. And this is why that result from Durban to decide in 2015 how much we're going to reduce and not start to 2020 is worrisome to me. Because if you look at the global level, if you wait till 2020, in order to reduce emissions enough to have a 50-50% chance, a 50-50 chance of avoiding what scientists have identified as dangerous climate change, more than 2 degrees Celsius, then you need to have a 10% per year reduction in carbon emissions. If you start sooner, you don't need a steeper reduction. So I said earlier, you know, we could all think of something to do to save 1.3% of our energy next year. If I told you you have to save 10%, that would be harder. And if I told you you have to do that every year, that's ever so much harder. So we really need to act soon. And just to show you actually what that difference looks like, this is what the graph looks like with a 2015 peak in energy use globally. This is what a 2020 peak looks like. And if we wait till 2025 for emissions to peak and we still want to avoid that dangerous climate change level, then we essentially have to have an infinite rate of reduction in energy emissions, in carbon emissions. That's not going to happen. So we really need to act soon. So what can we do about this? Well, besides the actions to reduce emissions, the other thing we can do is we can start getting ready to adapt. And Lori introduced me as the climate adaptation strategy lead for the Nature Conservancy. I'm supposed to help us figure out how we can adapt to climate change, and particularly how nature can help us adapt to climate change. You know, how we can do things like use forest management to capture more water, how we can restore floodplains to address flooding, and how we can restore reefs, marshes, and mangroves to protect shorelines. This work is happening now. These are photos from our programs in Nature Conservancy programs in New Mexico and Arizona, where we're working not only with traditional agencies like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management that think about nature and conservation, but we're working with the city of Santa Fe's water district as to how we're going to manage forests, both to trap more snow so that there's more water later into the spring to deliver to the cities, but also how we're going to reduce fire risks so we don't have problems like how Albuquerque had this spring when it had to actually shut off many of its water intakes because of all the sediment that was coming off of the burned lands into the Rio Grande. This is from Alabama, where 550 volunteers helped us to restore oyster reefs along several miles of shoreline. And we're working on what techniques can we use to restore oyster reefs in temperate waters, coral reefs in tropical waters. We've got 25,000 corals growing off the Florida Keys in coral nurseries right now, ready to be planted out into new reefs. And we're thinking about how do we work to understand the genetics of coral so we can identify the ones that are going to be more heat resistant and not have the problem that little Martinique had. So there are things that we can do by turning to nature and bringing nature to our rescue. That's important too, I think, in addition to the reducing emissions. So what can all of us do? What can you do? Well, there's basically, I think, two simple things and one harder thing. The simple things are investing your money and your time. In terms of money, we already talked about doing things to reduce your energy footprint. There's also a need for capital. Become an energy venture capitalist. Help make the transformation in the energy system. Consider who it is that you're supporting with your contributions to nonprofits. I recommend the 6 that are co-sponsoring this lecture. And also the politicians you support. This is a political problem. It is not largely a technological problem. And make your purchases count. Buying local is great, especially things that have to be shipped a long way, like, say, strawberries from Chile. Also, buying durable is important, particularly if you're buying something that has a lot of energy embedded in its creation, like a refrigerator or a washing machine or a chainsaw or a car. The longer it lasts, that has a huge benefit. In terms of investing your time, there's things you can do to educate yourself more about the issue. I recommend the Nature Conservancy Climate Change blog at change.nature.org. But also there's a wonderful website, skepticalscience.com, that covers the science side of climate change that I really recommend. There are a number of others. These are two very good ones. Letting your politicians know you care is really, really important. John Oliver once told me that he really does not hear on the issues from constituents very much. And I think he does, and that when he does, every letter gets attention. Volunteering, those folks who helped put in that oyster reef, they made a real difference. Finally, the hard thing, of course, is changing your lifestyle. And there are things we all could do. I will say, I don't think I've done any of these except for bicycling more in recent years. But they all would have a positive impact on the climate system. So again, we have the technology to start now. There are 2 electric cars on the market right now, the Nissan Leaf and the Chevy Bolt. We have solar power. This one happens to be in Cheryl's in my backyard. And we have wind power in places where it makes sense, like off our coasts. And we have ways to think about what nature can do to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Carbon sequestration projects. Those started in forest ecosystems. The Nature Conservancy has been very active in that and thinks it's an important strategy. It also now people are talking about blue carbon, about the carbon that's in coral reefs. Coral reefs are largely calcium carbonate, lots of carbon there. The carbon that is in mangrove systems, in salt marshes. So there's lots of ways that we can use nature, that we can use our management of nature to trap more carbon out of the atmosphere to help us as well. Alternatively, we could all just give up, in which case I really recommend distracting yourself with some good post-apocalyptic fiction. I've read the middle one here, Shipbreaker. I recommend it highly if you like sort of a young adult fiction. I'm hoping to read the other 2 soon. So finally, this is my email address. I'm happy to talk to anyone via email if you don't feel like freezing and asking questions now. And then these are the websites of the sponsoring organizations here. And I think that's all I wanted to say, so thank you very much. So please don't feel like you have to stay here and freeze, but I will stay and chat for quite a while. So, Bobby. I think that's a great point. For those of you who couldn't hear, what Bobby was saying was her brother had his vegetable garden in Oklahoma just die in the heat, wither in the heat. So he's shifting to more southwestern species. And I think that is a form of adaptation that we're all going to need to take. Project Native has started having this Friends of the Berkshires line of plants that's looking a little bit to our south for native plants that probably would now be doing well here. And could you just say your name when you stand up? Oh, okay. I think it's important to realize that the science I've just presented most of those graphs and figures came from reports from the leading agencies that have been studying our atmosphere and our climate and our world. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Air and Space Administration, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, all of the leading agencies and all of the leading climate scientists are in pretty close agreement about the general trends that I presented here. I tried to stay away from the things that are still uncertain and still in controversy. There are those. It's a very complex system. And it's not just here in the US. It's the corresponding agencies from every other country of the world, including those countries that really would like to come up with a reason to think that climate change isn't happening and they could just develop their coal-fired power plants like China and India. Their agencies, their scientific agencies, are every bit as convinced as our own. This past year, there was a physicist, not an atmospheric physicist, but a very credible physicist at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, who had been questioning some of the ways that the climate analyses had been done. And he got funding to go in and redo them in a way that he thought was more rigorous, including some funding from the Koch brothers? Koch brothers? I'm not sure how they pronounce their name. And he was sort of saying, this is going to really show whether climate change is happening or not. Well, his results came out, and they basically say, oh, I came up with exactly the same numbers that NASA and NOAA have been saying for the last couple of years. So I do not think that the climate change deniers, I don't think that they are doing anything except delaying us from doing what we need to do. Good point. We got lots of questions. Let's go over here. Just to emphasize what Eric just said, CET is a great organization. They helped us with an energy audit for our house before we put in that solar panel I showed, which in turn enabled us to qualify for state subsidies for that solar panel, which any of us are eligible for. And our estimate, Cheryl's and my estimate, is that we're going to see a rate of return on that solar panel of somewhere between 6 and 10% on our investment, which means that that's a high enough rate of return that even if you need to borrow money to do it, you can still make money off of it. So, Jim. They were looking at, they put them both in that category and a couple of other things that I'm not remembering what they were, because they were looking at non-energy sources of carbon emissions. In other words, it's not using energy to do something, it's another form of carbon emissions. So they just lumped all of those into one category. The study, which is, again, it's online in Science Magazine, I think it was January 6th of this year, actually spells out what types of measures can be taken in each of those areas.
And then just as a quick
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, there's the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, has been signed on to by 191 of the 195 countries that are part of the UN Framework Convention. Everyone except the United States, Andorra, South Sudan, and Afghanistan. That protocol, but Jim is correct that signing on to it doesn't necessarily mean that you follow through. And so of the countries that under the Kyoto Protocol were supposed to reduce emissions, some have done very well. Germany has reduced its emissions to 25% below its 1990 emissions levels, while remaining one of the strongest economies in the world and the #1 or #2 exporter in the world. Denmark, similarly. The Netherlands, similarly. England, I don't remember where Spain falls. Canada has done terribly. They got nowhere near their emissions targets. Their emissions increased instead of going down. And they've just announced, okay, the way we're going to deal with that is we're going to withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol. So there is a real issue with accountability. And that also worries me because with the agreement to not implement the Framework Convention targets till 2020, if people then fail as miserably as some countries have failed in the last 10 years, we're in real trouble. Let's see, over here. Now, who here knows what the questioner meant by ocean acidification? Not a lot, okay. So carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid. That's why Coca-Cola is so acidic, is when they put in the carbon dioxide to make the bubbles, it reacts with the water and you make carbonic acid. So when we increase the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then that carbon dioxide is absorbed into the ocean just by natural diffusion and equilibrium between the atmosphere and the ocean, that carbon dioxide reacts with the water to form more carbonic acid, and our oceans are actually becoming progressively more acidic. And many, many organisms that live in the ocean cannot operate properly in an acidic environment because the ocean is basically a very basic environment. It's the opposite of acidic usually. And so corals will, in the relatively near term, if we continue emitting carbon dioxide, corals will cease to be able to form their skeletons and coral reefs will cease to grow. Oysters and clams will not be able to make their protective skeletons, and so we're not going to have nearly as much shellfish. There'll be a lot of local variation due to local conditions. It's not like the whole ocean is going to be one way or another, at least at first. So the question is, what can we do about that? And the short answer is nothing that anyone has figured out yet. No one has come up with an adaptation measure for this. There are some people who are saying, could we add limestone to estuaries to have a localized effect, but ocean-wide, nothing. The good news, such as it is I said I didn't present some of the more controversial areas of science. Well, this is one of the places where we don't really know fully what's going to happen. There's a lot, we don't know how acidic the oceans are going to get or exactly how organisms will respond to that. It's an area of very, very active research, and we can hope that the research comes out saying the impact won't be as large as some scientists fear. Tom. So first of all, I should say that everything I'm saying today is my personal opinion and not necessarily representative of any of the sponsoring organizations, including the Nature Conservancy. There have been a number of economic studies that have shown that the least expensive way to rapidly reduce carbon in the atmosphere is to cut off and reduce the amount of deforestation that's happening on a global level, which is currently responsible for about 15% of the emissions every year. And if we could stop that, that doesn't require retooling power plants, that doesn't require buying a new car, that just requires a change in forest practices. The issue you are raising, how do you make sure that happens and how do you make sure it is maintained over decades of time, is a really challenging question. The trend in the climate negotiations to deal with that is to say that we really need those offsets and those reductions to be happening at a national level, and we need national commitment behind them. But right now, the techniques for measurement and the techniques for tracking it are not, they're not up to the national level for a good-sized country like Brazil and Indonesia, which have the highest emissions yet. So the Nature Conservancy is investing very heavily in improving those tracking techniques. We're working in Brazil and in Indonesia and in Mexico with the governments of those countries to get to that national scale. It will take time to do it. In truth, the problem that we have of sort of things sliding around, emissions targets sliding around, that is true of other areas of work as well. So for example, Germany, I gave that great example of how much they've reduced their emissions. Well, to some extent, they achieved that by starting to import more stuff from China. And so if you tracked their consumption and the carbon footprint of what they consume, as opposed to the carbon emitted inside their country, it wouldn't look as good. So that problem of sort of things shifting around is not unique to offsets. And it really speaks to the need for a global approach with national commitments, strong national commitments behind it. Problem. The UN is estimating that we'll have 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. We have about 7 billion right now. Those people, increasingly, people around the world want to live like we live. And that is a real challenge. And the more people we have, the bigger of a challenge it is, in my personal opinion. I think there's really, really good evidence that if you provide health care and if you provide education, that population growth rates go down. And that is really, I think that those need to be an important part of our policies around trying to address global warming and emissions as well. And so that's one of the reasons, when I look at this, I think that what we're facing is increasing disruptions, and that's going to result in people wanting to emigrate into countries that have a little more security, like the United States, and that's going to result in wars and famines and other problems around the world. And so I think that really it's a national security issue for us. Actually, the military thinks that too, and has recently the Defense Science Board published an analysis recently articulating all the ways in which it's a problem. And for us in terms of national security. So when I look at this and then I see people saying, why are we giving foreign aid for education and for population control and for health in the third world? Well, to me, those are really important things to do, not just because they're perhaps the morally right thing to do, but also because they are self-interest, because of our self-interest. They are helping sustain our national security moving forward. We got a lot of hands up. Jim, I'm going to pass you over because I already called on you. So over here. There's actually been a lot of work to test that. You can now, so if it was that the sun was warmer, you would expect that the temperature would rise more in the summer when the sun is shining more intensively on the northern hemisphere, here, or wherever you live. And that you would also see greater temperature rises during the day as opposed to the night. In contrast, if it's that it's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and it's having a sort of a blanketing, insulating effect, you'd expect the opposite. You'd expect winter temperatures to rise more, and you'd expect nighttime temperatures to rise more. In fact, that is what the evidence shows. The winter and the nighttime temperatures are rising. The summer and the daytime temperatures are rising less. Similarly, they now have satellites in space that can actually measure the amount of radiation being emitted from the Earth, and they can detect that that level of emission has gone down and is specifically going down in the wavelengths that are associated with carbon dioxide and methane, which is also a very potent greenhouse gas. So we're getting a lot of direct measurements that contradict the idea that it's a natural occurrence. I don't think there's any credibility to that at all. Yes, and it's actually, finally I get to say something positive and optimistic. I think it's a great thing for the environment. The reason being, the fundamental problem that we've got at its most basic level is that we are taking fossil carbon that was deposited into the earth hundreds of millions of years ago during the ages of the dinosaurs, and we are extracting it and burning it and emitting that carbon dioxide to the air. With wood heat, it's a much shorter cycle. You're emitting possibly more carbon per pound of wood that you're emitting, but as long as you are getting your wood from a sustainable and local source, the Nature Conservancy is very concerned about the movement of pests in firewood in terms of long distance movements. I strongly encourage you to buy your firewood locally. Not the subject of this afternoon's talk, but I could do whole nother one on that. you know, as long as you're buying your firewood from a sustainable source, you know, from a sustainably managed forest, I'm a big supporter of wood heat because you're not continuing to extract that carbon from these deep fossil sources. You're part of this shorter cycle. Now, there is a new study that I actually haven't had time to read because it just came out the day before yesterday that is looking at what we could do short term to address the heating of the earth. What are the steps we could take really quickly? And the two that they seem to be focusing in on are reducing methane emissions, because as I said, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So that has to do with cows, largely, and how cows are grazed. If cows are grazing on grass as opposed to being grain-fed, they emit much less methane. So back to Berkshire-grown, locally raised, grass-fed beef, if you're gonna keep eating beef. So you can reduce the methane, and the other problem is black carbon. And these are the little particles of soot. And when those fall on snow and ice, they actually can promote the rate of melting. And it turns out that black carbon can have a very significant feedback effect on the rate of warming, because once the snow melts, then you've got dark ground instead of white reflective snow, and you have faster warming. So in terms of your wood heat question, that's the Achilles heel there. Because wood stoves, unless they're really well managed, and some of these high efficiency ones, they do emit more of these particles. So choose your wood stove carefully. Jim is an expert on that, Jim Kelly in the back. And
you get the wood gasification system, secondary combustion really reduces.
Yeah, so be careful about what type of wood stove you run, be careful where your firewood comes from, but you can feel good about it from a carbon point of view. Boy, we got a lot of questions. So the fellow in yellow in the back. The short answer is it really probably isn't, in a lot of respects, different from some of the swings of climate that we've seen in the past. I mean, until 600, the Earth's been around for over 3.6 billion years, and until 600 million years ago, none of us could have breathed in its atmosphere. So there have been dramatic changes in the planet in the past. What's at risk isn't our planet. What's at risk is our society. We're trying to sustain 7 billion people, soon to be 9 billion people on this planet. And to do that, we have certain systems that we need to work. We need our agricultural system to work. We need clean water. And those are at risk. You know, the orderly society that we all rely upon to go home safely is at risk. The plant and many of the species of the planet will suffer, and some of them will go extinct, large numbers, which for those of us who care about natural beauty and natural ecosystems is also a concern. But what's really at risk at this point is more human society. And the last time that carbon levels were as high as they are predicted to be by the end of this century, the seas were 25 meters higher. That's about 75, 80 feet higher. So think about your favorite coastal city or your favorite beach or your favorite island, and that's a real problem. Because we have built New York and Key West and London in places where they have access to the sea, and it's a real concern. In the back with sunglasses. Renewable energy, and again, emphasizing this is my personal view. This is not the view of the Nature Conservancy or any of the other sponsoring organizations. I think that we are in real trouble as a society, and to fix that trouble, we are going to need to be smart about the investments that we make. And we don't have unlimited resources. We see that in the newspaper every day, but we also, many of us feel it in our bank accounts. So we're going to need to invest in a smart way in addressing our carbon emissions. So what that means is if we have state resources like tax credits that are going to energy efficiency, they should go to or to energy generation. Ideally, they should go to the places where it's going to do the most good. So in terms of wind energy, that really means that Massachusetts should be focused on the coast, and it should be focused offshore in terms of wind energy. In terms of solar energy, it doesn't really make much difference whether you're talking here or Boston or Cape Cod. And I do believe that we should be investing in solar energy. I personally am supportive of some of the larger scale solar projects that have been proposed recently. And as I mentioned, Cheryl and I have invested our personal resources in it. In the back? Yet. And the answer is yes, people are starting to look at it. And it is another of these areas like ocean acidification that I didn't speak to because the science is more controversial. But there was a paper published last year in, at this point 2010, in one of the medical journals that did what I think is the best analysis that I've seen so far on it, and it was terrifying. Because it looked at, climate, if we keep emitting carbon, it's not just the amount of warming we're going to have by the end of the century is the end of it. It will continue past that. And so it looked at what will happen by 2200, and it looked at what temperatures can a human body survive. And specifically, it looked at what temperature could you survive if you were continually drenched with water, naked, in a 25-mile-per-hour wind. And it revealed that, at least in terms of daytime temperatures, parts of the planet that are now inhabited by 57% of the world's population would become uninhabitable by 2200. You would not be able to go out in the daytime, or you would die. So, you might still have a few people living there being nocturnal. But even that, I suspect, will become risky during heat waves. And we already talked about, when you have a heat wave, you're putting more stress on those mechanical systems that you may be counting on to help you get through that heat wave. And if they fail, then you're in real trouble. So I think that this is an issue that has not gotten a lot of attention yet. I think it's a huge issue. There are studies that have begun to look at how much migration will be triggered how soon by climate change. And there's a lot of people who are going to be moving around the planet, and they are going to be looking for places where they can live. And we happen to live in one of the more northerly climates. We're going to have a fairly habitable climate for quite a while to come. We should expect a lot more people coming to join us.